This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this special holiday edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and once again, it's my pleasure to welcome my co-host, Scott Cutler, who is with the NYSE Euronext. And Scott, this is our show where we have a chance to look back at the year that's passed and say what events have been significant. But how about these special effects?
I like them.
No expense is spared on this show for special effects, but I think the viewer will agree with me that we may want to cut the snowflakes for the show. It's a little distracting, so if the control room, thank you. How about that? We even can stop the snow on that. Well, again, this is where you and I have historically looked back and looked at those issues that were big, and I'm going to let you start. And we want to cover a couple each of these issues, so go ahead, fire away.
In 2011, I want to start with a macro view, and that is managing through the post-financial crisis in a globally connected business environment. A long sentence, but let me explain what I mean. When we look at where we were in January through this year, we've seen political crises in Egypt and Tunisia and in Pakistan and Europe and now in North Korea and looking at relationships around the world that have geopolitical implications. And I think the big shift that we've seen, particularly in 2011, is a shift away from the West towards the emerging economies, towards the East, the rising influence of China. And I think from a board perspective, the opportunity now is actually how is it that the global shifts change business strategy going forward. Most of the companies that we interact with have global businesses. And so any company now has to take into account these global geopolitical shifts in terms of adjusting business strategy going forward. And I think that was the most significant change that I saw from a governance and business perspective in 2011.
You know, its impact has translated into a demand to have a more global board, too. We're seeing a request for directors that are either from other countries or certainly have experience in other countries. So we're seeing a change in the sort of the makeup of some of the boards. I'm sure it's a result of that, and I'm sure we're going to touch on it in the next thing when we look forward, because you just can't get away of what's happening in the world.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly.
Well, I'm going to take a little more narrow view, because the thing that I want to address, that's my issue looking back, is, you know, every year we have always done our research looking at what directors think. And one of the key questions that we ask during that is, what do you feel that you're least effective at as a board? And for the last 6 or 7 years, the research has been the same. And there's 2 issues that have surfaced continuously as the top issues that the boards feel least effective at. One is monitoring risk, and the second is CEO succession. If you look at those 2, I'm not sure, maybe with the exception of setting corporate direction, certainly picking the right CEO is the most important responsibility that the board has, but monitoring risk for the benefit of the shareholders long term is equally important. The amazing part for me is I have seen progress in those areas, particularly risk, but also in succession, yet I don't see that reflected in any of the research from year to year.
Interesting. Well, it's probably a nice transition into what I would give as my number 2 point. I think it's somewhat related, and that is actually the issue of the hot button around compensation. 2011 saw a pretty significant, I think, regulatory change that came out of Dodd-Frank, and that was the implementation of say-on-pay provisions, which required companies to go to their shareholders for advisory approvals for compensation packages. And I think if you look at the results of 2011, we only saw about 40 companies that failed to get majority support. And we saw about 8 lawsuits that came out of that failure. But I think more important than that is that we also established, I think, a new threshold, and that is somewhere in the 70 to 75% approval rating. To the extent a company did not get that level of support, many of the companies are then required to go back and revise or to reflect shareholder concerns in compensation arrangements, which impacted behavior. And so I think this was a regulation that was implemented in 2011. The downside wasn't nearly as scary as what we may have thought going into it, but in terms of the change of approach going forward, it has changed what people are doing.
I would agree. I think that we were expecting something worse, okay, by the regulations. And I think that for the most part, I think the companies handled it well, and I think that the shareholders handled it well. Now, we'll see if that, again, translates into something in the future, but a couple interesting points in that. First of all, the lawsuits. Legal experts consider those to be rather frivolous, yet it's still a tough decision for a company on whether they fight that and have the distraction, spend the money, keep their name in the press, or whether they settle. But if they settle, that's the incentive for the plaintiff's bar to keep bringing the lawsuit. So that's a tough dilemma if you think about it.
Yeah.
But that is a great segue into my next point, which I think is significant, which is withholding votes. Okay. One of the things that's come out of say-on-pay and all of the movement is this courage, if you will, or having this tool to withhold votes. And withholding votes on compensation committees was seen this year where people weren't happy with the pay. And I think that that is something that is going to be an issue. And if you're a director sitting on the board today, that has had an influence on you. No one wants to be embarrassed by the fact of not getting reelected. And subsequently, that puts work on the IR person and the corporate secretary to make sure that they are on top of everything.
My third point is actually in a few years when we're taken back to 2011 by the ghost of Christmas past and we're walked through the year. What we will actually see is this year has been a significant change in the regulatory environment. And that has largely been focused around Dodd-Frank, but nearly every industry has seen significant regulatory action. And so I think as a board member, the important thing to take away as a look back is the importance for education or advocacy or lobbying, given a shift in Congress, increased pace of rulemaking, and the severe implications that it has on business results going forward. So if you aren't taking into account that changing regulatory environment, you're missing out in a big way, I think, as a company and a board. You just have to be aware of it.
Well, that is in no case more true than what happened with the proxy access. I mean, we saw that as part of Dodd-Frank. And then mid-year, the lawsuit comes by the U.S. Chamber and the Business Roundtable. The court upholds that there wasn't due diligence done in the introduction. And then the SEC comes back and says, okay, we may not be able to do it in a sweeping sense, but we can do it company by company. And so those are the current rules in place. And it'll be an interesting year to see what happens with individual shareholder proposals.
Yeah, I would agree.
Well, you know, it's always fun. I'm a little worried that you're watching too many movies with your kids when you use the Ebenezer Scrooge thing. But
it's the season.
Yeah, it is the season. And we are very much looking forward to our next show, which will be last of the year, where we'll actually take a look forward and talk about the trends that are going to be happening. So that, along with all of our special effects here, is our show for our special holiday show. So we hope that you will join us when we do our end of the year look forward. And again, we appreciate everybody tuning in, and we'll do our best to cover the topics that make you a better director and committee member. Thanks for joining us.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.